He flashed a confident smile for the cameras just hours after a studio explosion tore 3 fingers from his hand. Another Hollywood legend, praised as a fearless performer, secretly struggled just to eat without pain. Now the curtain is lifting on 18 hidden stories the studios tried to keep quiet. Truth so shocking, even some co-stars never realized what was really going on. Harold Lloyd, a missing hand hiding in plain sight. In 1923, he shocked audiences by dangling from a giant clock tower 10 stories above the street, holding on with what looked like pure nerve and strength. People watching Safety Last saw a fearless stunt king whose grip looked stronger than gravity itself. But the real story was way different. 4 years earlier, Lloyd had lost his thumb and index finger in a freak accident with a prop bomb on set. The explosion almost blinded him and badly damaged his right hand. Newspapers told the public he made a full recovery, but that version of the story wasn't the truth. When Lloyd returned to filming, he wore a flesh-colored prosthetic glove built to hide the missing fingers. The rubber piece was stiff, sweaty, and often painful to wear during long shooting days. It limited his grip and left parts of his hand numb, especially during dangerous scenes. So every time he climbed a building or grabbed onto a speeding vehicle, he was really doing it with barely 1.5 working hands. Every stunt became a quiet gamble with serious danger. Studio bosses suggested he move into directing, thinking it was safer, but Lloyd saw that path as the beginning of fading away, and he refused to let that happen. So instead of stepping back, Harold Lloyd pushed even harder. He started designing stunts that were even more dangerous than before, determined to prove he was still a major box office draw, still strong, still unstoppable. The result was a series of breathtaking scenes that left audiences stunned in their seats. People watched in amazement, never realizing that one small mistake could have ended everything in seconds. Behind the scenes, the pressure around him was intense. Insurance companies had strict rules, and if anyone discovered the real condition of his hand, they could refuse to cover him completely. That meant his career, his reputation, and his income could disappear overnight. His contracts even included special clauses that stopped photographers from capturing his hand without the glove. Lloyd became incredibly skilled at hiding the truth. Through careful camera angles, clever staging, body doubles, and smart costume choices, he protected the illusion that nothing was wrong. But keeping that secret came with a cost. The prosthetic glove constantly rubbed against his skin until it became sore and raw. During long filming days, his hand would swell badly, and infections were always a serious risk. Still, he refused to complain. To him, the situation was simple. If Harold Lloyd stopped climbing buildings on screen, people might start believing he had already fallen. Fallen in the eyes of the audience, fallen with studio bosses, maybe even fallen in his own mind. Fans saw a fearless hero hanging from ledges high above the streets. What they didn't see was a man holding on for something much deeper, not just for the stunt, but for the chance to keep his place in Hollywood. Then there was Clark Gable, the man they proudly called the King of Hollywood. But behind that famous smile was a painful secret he worked hard to hide. With his strong jawline, slick hair, and confident charm, he dominated the screen in films like It Happened One Night and Gone with the Wind. Yet, by the time he reached his early 30s, a private struggle was already shaping the legend behind that iconic smile. By the time Clark Gable reached his early 30s, every single one of his natural teeth were gone. Years of neglected dental care and severe gum disease had destroyed them, leaving him with a painful, raw mouth that made everyday life miserable. The studios rushed him through full dental extraction surgery and quickly fitted him with dentures, hoping to keep their rising star looking perfect on screen. But those dentures never truly fit right. They caused constant mouth ulcers, sharp nerve pain, and even low fevers from recurring infections. Still, when the cameras rolled, Gable never showed a hint of discomfort. In Hollywood, weakness wasn't something leading men were allowed to show. His co-stars noticed the struggle, though. Vivian Leigh once wrote that kissing Gable felt like putting your lips against a hot stove. Joan Crawford reportedly dabbed peppermint oil inside her nostrils before romantic scenes just to deal with the strong odor from chronic mouth infections hidden behind that famous smile. Even small details created problems on set. The dentures sometimes produced a faint whistle when he spoke certain lines. Because of that, technicians had to redo scenes, and directors occasionally used stand-ins for tight close-ups, carefully matching clothes and posture so audiences would never notice the switch.
But the toughest battle was happening inside Gable himself. The Hollywood icon became extremely self-conscious about his teeth. He avoided eating in public and often covered his mouth when he laughed. Late at night, the man called the King of Hollywood would quietly place his dentures in a glass of water on the bathroom counter, worried that someone might see the truth behind the legendary smile that had captivated audiences across America. Off-screen, Clark Gable carried a quiet kind of embarrassment that followed him everywhere. The man who made audiences swoon lived with a constant fear that someone might discover the truth behind his famous smile. He worried that if people knew about his dentures and the pain behind them, it could shatter the strong, masculine image the studio had carefully built around him. Hollywood, obsessed with perfection, had no interest in showing the cracks. The illusion had to stay alive at all costs. So while Clark Gable ruled the screen like a king, the man behind the legend quietly battled insecurity and discomfort in private. To the world, he looked confident and untouchable, but behind the scenes, he often lived in fear that one wrong moment could expose the secret he tried so hard to hide. Then there was James Stewart and the limp the studios refused to acknowledge. In 1945, Jimmy Stewart stepped off a B-24 bomber as a decorated war hero. But when he returned to Hollywood, the first thing the studios noticed wasn't his bravery, it was the way he walked. The war had changed him deeply. Stewart had flown around 20 dangerous combat missions over Nazi-occupied Europe, surviving skies filled with anti-aircraft fire that ripped through planes like paper. When he came home, he looked thinner, quieter, and there was a subtle drag in his right leg. The limp came from nerve damage linked to his wartime service. The easy, relaxed stride audiences loved in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and the Philadelphia Story had been replaced with a more cautious movement. Studio executives quickly grew nervous. Their beloved leading man, America's golden boy, didn't move the way romantic heroes were expected to move anymore. One studio figure reportedly said, "We can't market damaged goods." From that moment on, the limp became something they tried to hide. Directors were told to film Stewart mostly from the waist up or block scenes so he was seated, leaning or moving slowly through shadows. Behind the scenes, he was pushed into exhausting physical therapy routines, not simply to heal, but to make sure the audience would never notice the difference. To hide the problem, studio trainers pushed James Stewart through exhausting drills between takes, trying to reshape the way he walked. They studied every step, every movement, trying to force his stride back into something Hollywood considered acceptable. It was never talked about publicly. The war was supposed to be his proud victory, not a scar the cameras could notice. One studio executive reportedly told a young assistant, "The American public can handle a soldier, they just can't handle a wounded one." That quiet rule hung over Stewart's career like a shadow. Stewart understood exactly what was at stake. He was one of the rare actors who didn't just perform patriotism for a script, he had lived it for real. But the price of his service followed him into every scene he filmed afterward. When he returned to the screen in It's a Wonderful Life, the tired look in his eyes wasn't just acting. That deep weariness came from real experiences, flying dangerous missions, seeing too much loss, and carrying memories that never fully faded. The limp was subtle, barely noticeable to most viewers, but for Stewart, it was a constant reminder of something Hollywood refused to accept, that even heroes come back changed. In the end, Stewart's quiet dignity lasted longer than the studio's attempt to hide the truth. But the fact that executives once tried to erase a war injury says everything about Hollywood during that era, a place where even bravery had to be polished, reshaped, and packaged before the public could see it. Then there was Judy Garland, a performer people described as unstoppable, but behind that incredible voice and energy, her body had been struggling from the beginning. By the time The Wizard of Oz filled American theaters in 1939, Garland was already dealing with constant pain. Not the kind you could easily notice on her face, but a deep, throbbing pain that settled into her hips and legs, following her through rehearsals, filming days, and endless performances.
Every time Judy Garland moved, there was a hidden struggle the audience never saw. One of her legs was slightly shorter than the other, creating a noticeable imbalance when she walked. It was a medical condition the studio never revealed to the public. Instead of addressing it openly, MGM quietly ordered custom shoes designed to hide the difference. Inside Dorothy's famous ruby slippers were special orthopedic inserts meant to balance her step. On screen, the shoes sparkled under bright lights and looked magical, but behind that shine, every step Garland took often came with a sharp twinge of discomfort. And the shoes were only the beginning of the pressure surrounding her. As she got older, the studio tightened control over every part of her appearance. Studio doctors and handlers constantly monitored her weight and energy levels with intense scrutiny. They frequently gave her what they called vitamin injections to keep her slim and energized. In reality, these treatments disrupted her natural rhythm and made her dependent on strict studio supervision. Behind closed doors, her schedule became relentless. Trainers pushed her through long rehearsals even when she was exhausted. Her joints ached, her body was still developing, and the imbalance in her legs slowly contributed to constant back pain. But rest wasn't something Judy Garland was allowed to prioritize. She was only 16 and already locked into a powerful studio contract. On screen, she could move audiences to tears with her voice and emotion. Behind the cameras, however, she was often treated like a product that had to be constantly adjusted and corrected. Studio memos sometimes mocked her posture and criticized any small change in her weight. Some reports even labeled her with harsh phrases like the fat one or not photogenic. What those notes never mentioned was the strain on her spine, her hips, and the intense expectations placed on someone so young. Still, she kept performing. She danced through the scenes, sang with stunning clarity, and delivered every note with power. Even when her legs trembled and her back ached through each chorus, Judy Garland kept smiling, a smile bright enough to fill an entire theater. Judy Garland didn't just perform while dealing with pain. In many ways, her entire career was shaped by it. The world saw the sparkle, the voice, the unforgettable charm that filled theaters with emotion. But what audiences never saw was the fragile structure holding everything together behind the scenes. By the time people truly understood the pressure she carried, the damage had already been done. Then there was Lon Chaney, a performer whose dedication pushed his body to shocking extremes. Lon Chaney Sr. became legendary in silent film for one reason. He didn't just act like different characters, he physically transformed into them. Directors called him the master of transformation because he could reshape his face, posture, and movement into almost anything a role demanded. But the real horror behind some of his famous characters didn't come from the makeup, it came from what he forced his own body to endure. Chaney was born to deaf parents, which meant he grew up communicating through expression and gesture. Every movement of the eyes, every shift of the mouth, every twitch of a brow became part of how he spoke to the world. That deep understanding of physical expression made his performances powerful and unforgettable. But when scripts required characters with extreme physical deformities, Chaney pushed things far beyond normal acting techniques. For the Hunchback of Notre Dame, he refused to rely on a simple costume trick. Instead, he strapped a heavy metal and leather rig to his back that forced his body into a twisted shape. The device reportedly weighed around 70 pounds and pressed hard against his ribs and spine during filming. The pressure was intense. Crew members often had to help remove the equipment between takes so he could catch his breath. Even after collapsing backstage from exhaustion, Chaney would return to the set and continue filming, determined to complete the performance. When people asked Lon Chaney why he refused to use lighter or safer makeup equipment, his response shocked them. He simply said, "Quasimodo suffered, I must suffer too." That mindset defined the extreme lengths he pushed himself to for every performance. For The Phantom of the Opera, Chaney created one of the most haunting looks audiences had ever seen. To achieve it, he inserted thin wires into his nostrils to pull them open in an unnatural shape. He used hooks inside his cheeks to stretch his face tighter and painted strong chemical mixtures around his eyes to create the hollow appearance of a skull. Those chemicals sometimes burned his skin so badly that he temporarily lost his sight during filming. Still, he continued working through it. His transformation for London After Midnight was just as intense. The design involved tight wires placed along his gums to pull his mouth into a disturbing grin. The pressure and irritation eventually led to a serious infection in his mouth that required medical treatment. But when reporters asked about his absence, the studio simply told the press he was suffering from exhaustion. Chaney was constantly praised for how real his monsters looked on screen, but very few people stopped to ask what that realism was doing to his body. Year after year, he kept pushing further, twisting his face and body into painful shapes to create unforgettable characters. Eventually, his health began to collapse. At just 47 years old, Lon Chaney died after complications from pneumonia. Some who knew him believed the illness was only part of the story. They felt the constant strain and physical punishment he endured had slowly worn him down over time. Lon Chaney didn't just play monsters, he poured real suffering into them. And by the time audiences applauded the performance, the man beneath the makeup was already fading from view.
Next came Barbara Payton, a rising Hollywood star whose life would spiral into tragedy, leaving behind a shattered body and a reputation the industry quickly tried to forget. Barbara Payton had the kind of beauty that could stop people in their tracks. Platinum curls, striking features, and a bold screen presence that lit up gritty films like Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye. When she stepped into a scene, audiences noticed immediately. For a moment, it looked like Hollywood had discovered its next unforgettable star. By the early 1950s, Payton was reportedly earning around $10,000 a week, an enormous paycheck for that era. Her career seemed to be rising fast, but behind the glamour, her life was spinning in a very different direction. Her personal relationships became messy and highly publicized, and tabloids quickly turned her into a favorite target for scandal headlines. The press often described her as reckless and out of control, but what many people didn't see was the constant physical pain she was dealing with away from the cameras. In the mid-1950s, Payton reportedly suffered a serious fall down a staircase in a run-down Los Angeles apartment building. The accident left her with a badly injured back and long-term pain that followed her for the rest of her life. Some reports later suggested the damage may have included crushed vertebrae and nerve injuries that made everyday movement extremely difficult. But by that point, the studios had already begun distancing themselves from her career. There were no big public medical updates, no studio doctors explaining the situation, just quiet silence. Executives labeled her difficult to work with and claimed she struggled with alcohol, and soon the roles stopped coming. Without steady work, medical care became harder to maintain. The injury slowly changed the way she walked. Her posture grew more strained, and the confident star audiences once recognized began fading from Hollywood's spotlight. By the 1960s, Barbara Payton's life had fallen into severe hardship. She moved between cheap apartments and struggled just to get by. Through all of it, the pain in her back never fully disappeared, a constant reminder of how quickly fame had vanished. In 1963, she released a memoir titled I Am Not Ashamed. The book revealed pieces of her story in raw detail, and through many of its pages, you can almost feel the exhaustion and pain behind the life she had lived. Barbara Payton wasn't looking for sympathy. More than anything, she just wanted someone to hear her story before the spotlight faded completely. Her life had once been filled with premieres, flashing cameras, and big paychecks. But in the end, the fame that came so quickly disappeared just as fast. When Barbara Payton died at only 39 years old, reports said she had just 55 cents left in her bank account. The tragedy wasn't only about money, though. The real loss was how quickly an industry that once celebrated her beauty turned away when her life became complicated.
Hollywood had loved Barbara Payton's face when it sold movie tickets, but when injury and scandal entered the picture, that same industry stepped back and left her to face the consequences alone. Then came another star hiding a very different kind of secret, Merle Oberon. She was promoted as exotic, mysterious, and absolutely flawless on screen. Under the glow of studio lights, Merle Oberon seemed like the definition of classic Hollywood beauty. But behind that polished image was a face marked with serious injury and a life filled with secrets she felt forced to hide. Oberon rose to fame during the 1930s and captivated audiences in films like Wuthering Heights. Her delicate appearance and emotional performances gave her an aura of old Hollywood mystery that studios loved to promote. But the dream surrounding her career was carefully constructed. In 1937, she survived a devastating car crash that nearly ended her life. The accident left the left side of her face badly injured, her cheekbone crushed, and important facial nerves damaged. For a time, part of her face became paralyzed, threatening the career she had worked so hard to build. Refusing to disappear from Hollywood, Oberon pushed forward. Her husband at the time, cinematographer Lucien Ballard, even helped design a special lighting technique, later called the Obi light, which softened shadows and helped hide the injuries on camera. The special lighting technique helped blur the scars and soften the signs of paralysis on Oberon's face. It worked so well that it eventually became a standard trick used across Hollywood sets. But behind every glamorous close-up was a woman quietly worried about being seen too clearly. Crew members later recalled small moments that revealed how difficult things really were for her. Because of nerve damage, Oberon sometimes couldn't feel parts of her face. Makeup artists would carefully check on her between takes, gently touching up the area because she couldn't always sense when saliva had slipped from the corner of her mouth. The cameras never caught it, and she made sure of that. But the injuries from the crash were only one part of the secret she carried. Oberon had been born in Bombay to an Anglo-Indian mother. In the rigid racial attitudes of 1930s Hollywood, that truth could have destroyed a career before it even began. So the studio completely rewrote her biography. Publicly, they claimed she was born in Tasmania to a white British family. Oberon stayed committed to that story for years, repeating it in interviews and public appearances because her future in film depended on it.
Maintaining the illusion required constant effort. Each morning, layers of pale makeup were applied under the hot studio lights to maintain the image Hollywood wanted audiences to see. The chemicals sometimes irritated her skin, leaving burns and rashes hidden beneath the glamorous finish. But the emotional strain may have been even heavier. Years later, when Oberon returned to India for filming, relatives who knew her earlier life came hoping to reconnect. According to accounts from that time, she told them she didn't recognize him and walked away. The moment reportedly left them heartbroken, while she continued protecting the story that had shaped her career. Merle Oberon became a timeless star in black and white cinema, yet the full truth about her background remained hidden for decades, making her both a celebrated legend and a mysterious figure in Hollywood history. Then there was Jean Tierney, a woman whose beauty was admired around the world, even as serious health challenges slowly changed the course of her life. Jean Tierney was often described as Hollywood's porcelain goddess. With delicate features and a calm, captivating presence, she seemed almost unreal on screen. Her performance in Leave Her to Heaven was so powerful that it earned her an Academy Award nomination. But behind that elegant image, Tierney was quietly dealing with challenges that very few people around her understood. One of those struggles was severe color vision deficiency. She had great difficulty telling certain colors apart, especially reds and greens. It might sound like a small problem, but on a movie set filled with costume changes, lighting tests, and makeup adjustments, it created constant awkward moments. During costume fittings, designers would ask what she thought about an emerald dress, a bright crimson lipstick. Tierney often smiled and nodded politely, even though she couldn't actually see those colors the way others did. To manage the situation, she developed her own system, memorizing outfits by the feel of the fabric, the texture, and even where they hung on the wardrobe rack. Admitting the truth felt risky in an industry obsessed with perfection, so she kept the condition private for years.
But an even more serious challenge began to affect her life later on. Under intense studio pressure and after several personal hardships, Tierney began experiencing severe mental health struggles. Over time, she dealt with deep depression and symptoms that many historians now believe were related to bipolar disorder. At the time, understanding of mental health was limited, and studios often treated these situations as problems that needed to be managed quietly. She was given so-called vitamin treatments, which were actually mixtures of medications intended to keep performers energized and working. In 1953, Tierney experienced a widely reported breakdown. She spent time in medical institutions where treatments such as electroconvulsive therapy were used. While intended to help, the procedures left her with significant memory difficulties that affected her for years afterward. When Gene Tierney eventually returned to acting, something had changed in a way audiences couldn't easily see. Memorizing long pages of dialogue, once a normal part of her craft, became extremely difficult. To keep scenes moving, cue cards were often placed just out of the camera's view, quietly helping her through each line. In her autobiography, Tierney described that period with heartbreaking honesty. She wrote, "The face they knew was still there, but behind it, I was fading. The woman audiences recognized on screen still looked the same, yet inside, she was struggling to hold on to the career she once moved through so effortlessly." Yet, even through that fog, Gene Tierney carried herself with remarkable grace. Then came Bela Lugosi, the man whose hypnotic stare helped define cinema's most famous villain. When Lugosi appeared as Dracula in 1931, audiences were captivated by the slow, deliberate movements and the piercing gaze that seemed to freeze characters in place. Many viewers assumed it was simply brilliant acting, but the truth was more complicated. Years earlier, Lugosi had suffered serious injuries during World War I. Shrapnel wounds left lasting damage to his lower back and legs. By the time he arrived in Hollywood, the pain was constant, sharp, exhausting, and always close behind every step he took. Bela Lugosi walked with a slight limp that many viewers never noticed. His movements often looked stiff because bending at the waist sent sharp jolts of pain through his spine. But when the camera started rolling, Lugosi transformed that limitation into something unforgettable. Dracula didn't move like ordinary people, and part of that eerie style existed because Lugosi physically couldn't move the same way anymore.
His famous stare had another hidden reason behind it. Lugosi suffered from severe nearsightedness. Off camera, he relied on thick prescription glasses just to see clearly, but those glasses couldn't appear in a Dracula film. Without them, he could barely focus on anything more than a few feet away. So those intense, hypnotic looks audiences found so chilling were often a man straining to focus on shapes he could barely see. Strangely enough, that struggle created the mysterious effect that made the character even more powerful. Behind the scenes, though, things were far less glamorous. Lugosi sometimes bumped into set pieces or tripped over cables because his vision was so limited. Some crew members quietly assumed he was clumsy or distracted. In reality, he was navigating complicated movie sets almost blindly. The physical pain from his war injuries never disappeared either. As the years passed, the strain grew worse. To keep working through the discomfort, Lugosi reportedly relied heavily on medication prescribed to manage the constant pain. During breaks between takes, assistants sometimes noticed him gripping chairs or furniture while waiting for the next scene. His face would grow pale as he tried to steady himself. The moment the director shouted "cut," crew members often hurried over to guide him back to a seat before the exhaustion caught up with him. Rather than slowing production or offering meaningful support, the studio system simply kept pushing forward, determined to keep the legendary Dracula image alive on screen. Bela Lugosi's pain quietly shaped the character that made him famous. The stiff way Dracula moved, the slow pacing of his speech, even the long pauses in his dialogue were partly influenced by the injuries Lugosi carried from the war.
What audiences interpreted as chilling control and dark menace was often the result of a man managing real physical limitations. Some historians have suggested that lingering effects from wartime injuries even affected his speech and timing. Instead of recognizing the struggle, the studio system simply embraced the illusion. The myth of Dracula grew larger with every film, while the man behind the cape slowly faded into the background. Lugosi didn't just portray a monster on screen, he carried the weight of constant pain and exhaustion off-screen as well. When the cameras stopped rolling and the applause faded, he was left alone with the aches, the shadows, and the silence of an industry that valued the character far more than the person playing it. Then there was Katharine Hepburn, a woman many people described as eccentric, sharp, and completely fearless. But behind that confident image was a private battle she rarely spoke about. By her early 30s, Hepburn had developed what doctors call an essential tremor, a neurological condition that causes involuntary shaking in the head and hands. In an era when Hollywood demanded perfect poise from its leading ladies, visible tremors could have ended a career quickly. Studio executives quietly labeled her nervous or difficult, never openly acknowledging the real condition. So Hepburn adapted in her own clever way. She developed a quick, clipped speaking style that helped disguise the subtle shaking of her head, turning what could have been a vulnerability into her unforgettable voice and rhythm. Her wardrobe also became part of the strategy. High-necked blouses, elegant scarves, and cleverly designed costume pockets helped hide the tremor in her hands. What audiences saw as bold personal style was also a carefully managed way to keep control of a condition she refused to let define her. Everything people came to recognize as classic Katharine Hepburn, the sharp voice, the confident posture, the elegant wardrobe, had a deeper purpose. None of it happened by accident. Each mannerism helped her manage the tremor she worked so hard to keep hidden. Behind the scenes, directors who worked closely with her learned how to frame scenes carefully. Filmmakers like George Cukor often planned longer takes, smoother camera movements, and blocking that allowed Hepburn to stay in motion. Movement helped disguise the tremor. Standing completely still made the tremor more noticeable, so the camera rarely lingered on her without action. That constant control required enormous effort. Off the set, Hepburn became extremely selective about public appearances. She often avoided large dinners and social events, worried the tremor might become visible. Some people assumed she was distant or aloof. In reality, she was simply protecting the career she had fought so hard to build. The situation grew even more complicated within the studio system. At times, when Hepburn pushed for stronger roles or better working conditions, certain executives used her condition as pressure, hinting that the secret she guarded so carefully could become public. Eventually, she stepped away from Hollywood for nearly 5 years. It wasn't because her talent had disappeared, it was because maintaining that carefully controlled image had become exhausting. But when Hepburn returned, she did it with remarkable strength and confidence. Over the course of her career, she would go on to win 4 Academy Awards for acting, a record that still stands today. Katharine Hepburn didn't just survive the Hollywood system. In many ways, she outplayed it. The qualities she once tried to hide became part of the very style audiences admired most. What some once saw as a weakness eventually became a signature. Then there was Lionel Barrymore, a man who had once stood among Hollywood's biggest stars before a life-changing condition forced his career into a very different direction. Lionel Barrymore came from one of the most famous acting families in Hollywood history. The Barrymore name carried enormous weight on both stage and screen. Lionel himself had a commanding presence, strong voice, powerful delivery, and a dignity that made audiences pay attention the moment he appeared. But by the early 1930s, something about his performances began to look different. Viewers noticed he was rarely shown standing during scenes. Directors carefully staged him behind pianos, desks, or tall chairs that kept most of his body out of focus. What the audience didn't realize was that Barrymore was dealing with intense physical pain. He suffered from severe arthritis that slowly twisted and stiffened his joints. Simple movements became extremely painful, sometimes feeling like bone grinding against bone. And the situation grew worse after a serious hip fracture that never fully healed. Walking became incredibly difficult, and getting across a film set could take enormous effort. At first, the studio tried to hide the problem rather than address it. MGM reportedly fitted him with heavy metal braces under his costumes, hoping he could continue standing on camera. The devices were uncomfortable and restrictive, built more to conceal his condition than to help him heal. Barrymore endured long hours of filming while wearing them. When scenes ended, he often returned to his dressing room completely exhausted from the strain. Despite the discomfort, he rarely complained. In that era of Hollywood, actors who appeared difficult or unable to perform risked losing their roles entirely. Eventually, the pain became too overwhelming to hide. The braces were set aside, and Barrymore began using a wheelchair. A compromise followed. MGM agreed he could continue acting, but many roles were adjusted so his characters remained seated. Judges, wealthy businessmen, powerful figures who delivered their lines from behind desks or large chairs. The camera adapted, and so did Lionel Barrymore. One of Lionel Barrymore's most unforgettable performances came as Mr. Potter in It's a Wonderful Life. On screen, audiences saw a cold and powerful banker sitting in a wheelchair delivering sharp lines with icy confidence. What many viewers never realized was that the chair wasn't just part of the character, it reflected the actor's real condition. Behind the performance, Barrymore was dealing with a severe degenerative illness that made standing and walking extremely painful. Hollywood only acknowledged his situation when it became impossible to hide. Even then, the support he received came with a cost. His salary was reduced, and studio publicity carefully avoided discussing the full truth. Press releases often blamed a single past injury rather than the ongoing medical condition affecting his body. Studios worried openly describing a star as physically limited might damage the powerful image they worked so hard to protect. Hollywood was obsessed with the illusion of strength. Admitting vulnerability didn't fit the story they wanted audiences to believe. Yet Barrymore refused to disappear. Even though he could no longer stand the way he once had, he remained a commanding presence in every scene. Seated or not, his voice, timing, and powerful expressions made him impossible to ignore. In a quiet way, Lionel Barrymore changed how strength could appear on screen. He proved that presence didn't come from standing tall, it came from the force of the performance itself. Then came Montgomery Clift, a rising star whose life changed in a single terrifying moment. In 1956, Clift was considered one of the most striking and talented actors in Hollywood. He brought a thoughtful, emotional depth to his roles that felt completely different from the tough, untouchable heroes of the time. But one night, after leaving Elizabeth Taylor's home in Beverly Hills, Clift's car lost control on a winding road. The vehicle crashed violently into a stone wall, leaving behind a devastating accident that would alter his life and his career forever. The crash left Montgomery Clift with devastating injuries. His nose, cheekbone, and jaw were shattered in the impact. When rescuers pulled him from the wreckage, he was barely breathing, his shirt soaked with blood from the violent collision. Elizabeth Taylor, who had been with him earlier that evening, reportedly rushed to the scene. According to several accounts, she reached into his mouth to clear his airway, helping him breathe until medical help arrived. It was a desperate moment that may have saved his life. Doctors worked urgently to repair the damage. Surgeons wired his jaw shut and used metal plates to rebuild parts of his face that had been crushed in the crash. The procedures helped stabilize him, but the delicate balance of his features had changed. After the surgeries, the difference was noticeable. One cheek sat lower, his smile had become stiff, and the expressive face audiences once knew looked slightly altered. The studios tried hard to hide it. Cinematographers favored his left side, softened the lighting, and carefully staged scenes to make the changes less obvious. Elizabeth Taylor supported him strongly during filming for Raintree County, helping him return to work. But Clift understood what had happened. The man audiences remembered was still there, yet something felt different, like a once perfect photograph that had been slightly blurred. The physical pain never truly faded either. Eating could be uncomfortable, smiling required effort, and the emotional weight of the accident followed him everywhere. Over time, he grew more withdrawn, struggling with the loss of the face that had helped launch his career. Some people described him as unpredictable in later years, while others believed he was simply overwhelmed by the lingering effects of the crash. Whatever the reason, his career slowed, and the studios that once celebrated him began keeping their distance.
Montgomery Clift lived for another decade, and respected filmmakers like John Huston and Elia Kazan still admired his remarkable talent. But the effortless rise he once seemed destined for had been permanently changed by that single night. Montgomery Clift's face may have been rebuilt after the accident, but the deeper wounds were harder to repair. The confidence that once made him Hollywood's golden boy slowly faded. In its place was a quieter, more fragile presence. Yet, in that painful transformation, Clift became something rare in cinema history. He was no longer just a handsome leading man. He became a tragic symbol of what happens when an industry builds careers on beauty alone, and how quickly everything can change when that image cracks. Then there was Peter Lorre, a performer whose unforgettable presence often placed him on the darker side of the screen. With his haunting eyes, sharp voice, and tense, restless energy, Lorre became one of the most distinctive actors of his era. Audiences remember him from films like M and The Maltese Falcon, where his nervous intensity made every scene feel unpredictable. But that tension viewers noticed wasn't simply acting. Much of it grew from real physical discomfort and a body that had dealt with challenges since childhood. Peter Lorre was reportedly born with serious foot abnormalities. Some accounts suggest they were congenital, while others believe illness during childhood may have affected the shape of his feet and the way he walked. Whatever the cause, by the time he reached Hollywood, his gait had a noticeable drag and his feet turned inward at unusual angles. Instead of offering medical support, the studio system often turned the difference into a casting shortcut. Directors repeatedly placed him in roles as criminals, schemers, and uneasy characters lurking in the shadows. He was rarely given the romantic lead or heroic roles common for many stars. Instead, Lorre became the suspicious stranger, the uneasy informant, the man audiences were meant to distrust the moment he appeared on screen. Costume designers tried to hide his foot condition with specially made shoes, but the limp remained visible. Combined with his accent and unique appearance, it shaped the type of characters Hollywood expected him to play again and again. Despite Peter Lorre's popularity with audiences, the studios never fully trusted him. Warner Brothers used his talent again and again, placing him in memorable roles, but behind the scenes, he was often treated as expendable. Even after appearing in successful films, he was frequently underpaid and passed over for larger opportunities. Lorre tried several times to break out of the narrow roles assigned to him. He wanted to direct, to write, and to shape his own image instead of being locked into the same type of character. But many of those efforts quietly stalled. Promises were made, then forgotten, leaving him stuck in the same cycle of roles. Over time, the frustration began to wear him down. By the 1950s, reports described Lorre as deeply exhausted by the constant pressure. He openly spoke about feeling trapped, both in the physical challenges he carried and in an industry that refused to see him as anything beyond the strange villain in the corner of the frame. He continued working wherever opportunities appeared, horror films, television shows, even comedies. But the spark people once saw in him seemed to fade as the years passed. The strain showed on his face, and his health declined faster than many expected. Still, when the camera turned on, Peter Lorre delivered everything he had. Behind every unsettling villain he portrayed was an actor determined to prove he was capable of far more than the labels placed on him. In many ways, the real tragedy wasn't the characters he played. It was how Hollywood sometimes treated physical difference as a permanent casting decision, rather than a small part of a much larger talent. Then there was Mary Astor, a star known for elegance and composure during Hollywood's golden age, whose later years revealed a very different and quieter struggle. Mary Astor possessed a kind of beauty that immediately caught the camera's attention. But what truly made her unforgettable wasn't just her appearance, it was the intelligence and control she brought to every performance. Her sharp delivery and calm authority helped make her one of the most respected actresses of Hollywood's golden age. Behind that polished image, however, her life was filled with difficult moments that rarely made it into the glamorous studio publicity. Earlier in her career, Astor was pulled into a highly publicized custody battle that exposed deeply personal details about her private life. Portions of her personal diaries even became part of the courtroom drama, creating headlines that threatened to derail her career completely. Despite the scandal, Astor refused to disappear. She kept working, adapted to changing film styles, and eventually reinvented herself during the 1950s as a respected character actress. Many performers would have faded after such controversy, but she managed to rebuild her reputation through determination and skill. Years of pressure and stress eventually caught up with her. In the 1950s, Astor suffered a stroke that affected her speech and physical coordination. The expressive face audiences once knew began to show subtle changes, and her voice, once smooth and confident, sometimes trembled unpredictably. Public appearances became less frequent as she gradually stepped away from the spotlight. The woman who had once commanded scenes in elegant gowns and dramatic lighting began living a much quieter life. She had faced periods of deep emotional strain earlier in her life, and now physical limitations added another layer of difficulty. Over time, she withdrew almost completely from public attention.
In her later years, Mary Astor lived in a modest retirement home for actors. It was a peaceful place, but very different from the glamorous Hollywood world where she had once stood at the center of attention. Visitors who saw Mary Astor in her later years often spoke about her eyes. They said there was still a spark of awareness in them, a quiet intelligence that hadn't disappeared. But she rarely held eye contact for long, as if part of her attention was drifting somewhere else, perhaps toward memories of the life she once lived in front of the camera. Even then, she never asked anyone for sympathy. In her later memoirs, Astor wrote about accepting life as it arrives, both the good moments and the painful ones. It was a simple but powerful philosophy that reflected the way she carried herself through decades of public praise, criticism, and personal struggle. Hollywood had celebrated her, exposed her private life, lifted her up, and at times pushed her aside, sometimes all within the same chapter of her career. Yet she never allowed bitterness to define her final years. In a quiet way, Mary Astor's final performance may not have been on a movie screen at all. It was the dignity with which she stepped away from the spotlight. No dramatic farewell, no loud resentment, just a graceful retreat from an industry that had long moved on from the battle she had fought behind the scenes. Then came Susan Peters, a young actress whose rising career changed forever in a single tragic moment. In the early 1940s, Susan Peters was one of MGM's brightest new stars. Her performance in Random Harvest earned her an Academy Award nomination, and many believed she was on the path to major Hollywood success. She had the rare ability to convey powerful emotion with subtle expressions, making even quiet scenes feel intense and meaningful. But in January 1945, during a hunting trip with her husband, a tragic accident occurred. A rifle discharged unexpectedly, and the bullet struck her spine. The injury caused immediate paralysis from the waist down, an event that would change the course of her life and career overnight. Hollywood didn't know how to react to Susan Peters after the accident.
In an industry built on flawless images and glamorous movement, a rising star suddenly using a wheelchair made executives uneasy. Like many performers whose lives no longer matched the studio fantasy, they were quietly pushed to the side. But Susan Peters refused to vanish. Instead of stepping away from acting, she returned to the screen in the late 1940s with remarkable determination. In 1948, she starred in The Sign of the Ram, playing a woman who also used a wheelchair. The role was strikingly honest for its time. There were no camera tricks to hide the reality, no elaborate illusions to pretend everything was normal. Audiences saw a powerful performance from a woman openly living with the same condition as the character she portrayed. Critics praised her courage and emotional depth, yet behind the applause, the industry still struggled to accept what they were seeing. Producers hesitated when it came to offering new roles. Many studio executives worried that audiences might not accept a leading actress who could not walk. The same performer once seen as the promise of Hollywood's future suddenly faced an uncertain career. Scripts stopped arriving, phone calls slowed, then faded completely. The pressure affected her personal life as well. Reports from that time suggest her marriage eventually collapsed under the strain created by the accident and the sudden shift in her career. Friends later described Peters as both incredibly brave and deeply exhausted. She had shown resilience, talent, and determination after the injury, yet the opportunity she hoped for never fully returned. It was the kind of quiet exhaustion that comes from fighting with everything you have, only to realize the world may still refuse to see you the way it once did. Susan Peters passed away at only 31 years old. Her life had changed dramatically after the accident, but what truly failed her wasn't her determination. It was the narrow thinking of an industry that didn't know how to support a star whose circumstances had changed. Even after losing the use of her legs, Peters showed remarkable courage. She continued acting, returned to the screen, and faced the public with honesty and strength. Her story isn't defined by the quiet ending of her career. It's remembered for the determination she showed when the spotlight shifted and she still chose to stand tall in her own way. Then came Frances Farmer, a young actress whose outspoken nature brought her into direct conflict with the Hollywood system. Frances Farmer was intelligent, bold, and unafraid to speak her mind. She questioned studio contracts, challenged authority, and refused to put on a cheerful performance if she didn't genuinely feel it. In the 1930s studio era, that kind of independence could quickly make powerful people uncomfortable. She arrived in Hollywood with major attention after early stage and film performances like Come and Get It and Rhythm on the Range. Critics noticed her talent immediately. But while audiences admired her intensity, studio executives often viewed her unwillingness to conform as a problem. Soon she was labeled difficult, and gossip columns began portraying her as rebellious and unpredictable. Yet many observers later suggested that she was simply trying to maintain control over her own life in an industry that expected complete obedience.
Over time, rumors about her mental health began circulating. Reports describe periods of emotional distress and unpredictable behavior. Instead of receiving understanding or support, the studio system gradually distanced itself from her. Her contract was eventually suspended, her roles disappeared, and the career that once seemed full of promise began slipping away from the Hollywood spotlight. Frances Farmer was eventually placed in several mental health institutions, some of which later became known for harsh and controversial treatment methods. At the time, the public knew very little about what life inside those facilities looked like. The details remained hidden behind locked doors and strict silence. Years later, accounts from former patients and staff described difficult conditions, heavy medication, strict confinement, and an environment where many voices went unheard. Those reports only deepened the mystery surrounding what Farmer experienced during that period of her life. One of the most persistent rumors claimed she had undergone a lobotomy, a surgical procedure once used in certain psychiatric treatments during that era. If it had happened, it could have permanently affected the brilliant mind that once captivated audiences. However, historians have never found definitive proof that the procedure was actually performed. Still, the rumor spread widely and became part of the legend surrounding her story. When Farmer was eventually released, the life she returned to looked very different from the one she had left behind. She attempted to rebuild her career, appearing occasionally on television and even hosting a small talk program. The determination was still there, but the spark people remembered from her early fame seemed more fragile. During interviews later in life, she sometimes spoke in reflective, almost mysterious phrases. At one point she remarked, "I have been miscast." Then she added that it wasn't in film she meant, but in life itself. Many observers later suggested that Frances Farmer's downfall wasn't simply about personal struggles. It was also shaped by an industry that often reacted harshly to performers who challenged authority or refused to follow expectations. Next came John Garfield, a powerful actor whose career was cut short by a hidden health condition and the intense pressures of his time in Hollywood. John Garfield built his reputation playing rebels, fighters, and working-class heroes who refused to back down. On screen, he looked fearless, raw energy, sharp intensity, and the kind of presence that made every scene feel electric. Films like Body and Soul and The Postman Always Rings Twice turned him into one of Hollywood's most compelling anti-heroes. But the real battle in Garfield's life wasn't happening in front of the camera. It was happening inside his chest. As a child, Garfield had suffered from rheumatic fever, an illness that permanently weakened his heart. Doctors warned him early on that he needed to be careful. They told him to avoid intense stress, avoid extreme physical strain, and protect the fragile rhythm keeping his heart going. Garfield ignored those warnings. He only knew how to live one way, full speed ahead. Long filming days, late-night rehearsals, public appearances, passionate speeches. He threw himself into everything with relentless energy. If exhaustion never caught up with him, he hid it behind charm and determination. To the public, he looked unstoppable. By the late 1940s, however, the pressure around him began to shift. The House Un-American Activities Committee started investigating Hollywood, and Garfield's outspoken support for progressive causes suddenly placed him under scrutiny. When questioned, Garfield refused to accuse colleagues or provide names. He stood firm, protecting the people he worked with, but the decision carried consequences. Studios that once proudly promoted his name began distancing themselves. Roles grew scarce, opportunities disappeared, and the stress surrounding his career intensified. Behind closed doors, friends reportedly noticed the toll it was taking on him. Garfield often appeared exhausted. At times, he would quietly press his hand against his chest or lean against a wall, saying it felt like something was tightening deep inside. Yet, he never spoke publicly about the pain. Garfield refused to show weakness or ask for sympathy. Pride and the determination to keep going pushed him forward, even as the strain around him continued to grow. On May 21, 1952, John Garfield's fight finally ended. He died of a heart attack at just 39 years old, found alone in a friend's apartment in the same city that had once celebrated him as one of its brightest stars. There were no grand studio tributes, no sweeping Hollywood memorials. The industry that once promoted his name so proudly stayed mostly silent. His funeral was quiet, and over time his legacy faded from the spotlight. Garfield became one of the earliest major actors caught in the shadow of Hollywood's blacklist era, despite never being formally convicted of wrongdoing. The pressure surrounding his career, combined with his already fragile heart, had pushed him to the limit. In the end, John Garfield didn't fall because of scandal or failure. His story was shaped by a painful clash between personal integrity and overwhelming pressure. His body simply could not keep up with everything the world demanded from him. Then there was Hattie McDaniel, a woman who made history in Hollywood while still facing barriers that never truly disappeared. In 1940, McDaniel stood proudly at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles and accepted the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for her role as Mammy in Gone with the Wind. It was a historic moment. She became the first black performer ever to win an Oscar. Yet the celebration carried painful contradictions. Because of segregation rules at the time, she was not allowed to sit with many of her co-stars during the ceremony. Accounts from the event say she was seated separately near the back of the room, even while being honored for one of the night's biggest awards. Still, she accepted the award with dignity and gratitude. Hollywood praised her as a pioneer, but the opportunities offered to her remained extremely limited. Throughout her career, Hattie McDaniel appeared in more than 70 films, yet she was often restricted to similar supporting roles. When she spoke up about wanting more complex characters, studio leaders sometimes responded by telling her she should simply be thankful for the work she had. When Hattie McDaniel spoke her mind, critics were quick to label her too loud, too demanding, or too proud. But she understood exactly what she was fighting for. At one point, she famously said, "I'd rather play a maid and make $700 a week than be one for $7." That statement wasn't surrender, it was survival in an industry that limited her choices while still expecting her gratitude. Off-screen, the pressure surrounding her groundbreaking success was enormous. The very roles that made her famous also placed her in the middle of fierce debate. When film opportunities slowed down, McDaniel turned to radio work and other projects just to keep income flowing. During the political tensions of the Red Scare era, her career was further damaged when she was quietly pushed aside by powerful industry figures. At the same time, some civil rights groups criticized the types of roles she had been given in films. It left her standing in a painful space where neither side fully understood the difficult position she had faced. In 1952, Hattie McDaniel passed away from breast cancer. Much of the wealth she had earned during her career had been drained by medical expenses, difficult contracts, and years with fewer acting opportunities. She had asked to be buried at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, a place closely tied to the film industry she helped shape. But at that time, the cemetery did not allow black burials, and her request was denied. She was laid to rest elsewhere, without the grand tribute her accomplishments deserved. Decades later, admirers and historians funded a memorial honoring her legacy. It came long after her passing, but it ensured that her achievements would never disappear from history. Hattie McDaniel broke barriers that others were afraid to challenge. She opened doors that future performers would walk through for generations. If these stories meant something to you, don't let them fade away. Like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel to keep these powerful Hollywood stories alive. Until the next video, we'll uncover more forgotten truths, one name and one story at a time.